Okay, hello and welcome to the third session of Sunoikis Digital Classics Summer Semester 2018. As I said, this is our third session, and today our guest is James Tauber, who is the developer of the Scaife Digital Library Viewer. And the Scaife Digital Library Viewer is an open source reading environment for the Perseus Digital Library, developed as part of the Greek and Latin, Open Greek and Latin project. And James is now part of our Sunoikis Digital Classics community. This is his first session, so James, welcome to Sunoikis and thank you very much for your contribution today. Unfortunately, we have a problem today with the camera, so we can only see the picture of James, but anyway, he will share his screen and he can talk. So James, welcome.
Thank you very much, Monica, and thank you for the opportunity to take part in this. I've been a long-time watcher, and it's good to have the opportunity to participate. So let me just share my screen, and we'll get started.
Okay, I can see your screen,
and the slides are up.
Okay, it works. Perfect.
Excellent. Okay, so as Monica mentioned, I've been one of the developers on the Scaife Viewer for the Perseus Digital Library. I'm a professional Python and web developer, have been for many years. I run a company called Eldarion, but I also have a parallel life as a linguist with a particular interest in morphological theory, historical linguistics, corpus linguistics, and second language acquisition, all in the context of ancient Greek. And so the Scaife Viewer project has been very exciting for me as a way of combining those two worlds, the professional software and web development world with my strong interest in linguistics and ancient Greek. You can find out more about the sort of linguistics side at jktauber.com. You can follow me on Twitter at jtauber. So the outline of today's session is to talk briefly about the sort of history and motivation of the Scaife Viewer, to give you an initial tour of the interface, and then we'll take a step back and talk a little bit about the pipeline that gets texts into the Scaife Viewer. We'll talk about some of the underlying concepts and technologies and specifications around that. We'll look a little bit at the architecture. We'll then go back to a demo of Scaife to look at some things in more detail that will help hopefully make more sense in the context that we've discussed. And then we'll dive a little bit into some code examples. I won't do too much of that, but I really want to give you a flavor of, you know, sort of what the user interface looks like, what the underlying architecture and technologies are, and then dive a little bit into an example of some code. And then finally, I want to wrap up talking about how you can contribute to this project and give a sort of bit of a roadmap for future work, the kinds of things that we'd like to work on in the project. Okay, so first of all, to talk a little bit about the motivation for the Scaife Viewer. What is it and how did it come about, and sort of how does it fit into the larger context of the Perseus Digital Library? I'm sure most of you, if not all of you, are very familiar with the Perseus Digital Library, which goes back to the 80s, really with the vision of making these historical language texts available openly. Now, of course, starting in the mid-80s, or being conceived of in the mid-80s as it was, it predates the World Wide Web. And so Perseus has had this long history through various technologies. In the mid-90s, launching with a web interface all the way through to version 4, referred to as Hopper, which launched just under 10 to 15 years ago, I believe. And that's the interface that you see now if you go to the Perseus site. The Hopper interface that was developed 10 to 15 years ago. There's been some continuing work on it, but it's essentially the sort of thing that's been there for the last 10 to 15 years. Now, the motivation for doing a brand new interface for the Perseus Digital Library was essentially twofold. One was to make it much easier to add new texts. The existing system made it difficult to expand the corpus of texts covered. And obviously, a big mission of the Perseus Digital Library and projects such as the Open Greek and Latin project, which I'll get to in a minute, you know, the goals of those projects are to greatly expand the texts that are available. And so there was a need for a system that made it much easier to add new texts to. And secondly, to build a more open and extensible platform. And this is really one of the goals of the Scaife Viewer, is to provide not just a reading environment for the existing corpus, but to actually be a community of developers that are working on this reading environment and being able to use it for a whole range of different things. And so that's those two things in particular, making it easy to add new texts and having a more open and extensible platform, was the motivation for the development of the Scaife Viewer. So the Scaife Viewer has been developed as part of the Open Greek and Latin project. As Monica mentioned as well, the funding for the work that Eldarion did was through the Alexander von Humboldt Chair of Digital Humanities at the University of Leipzig. My company, Eldarion, won the contract to do the initial development, but all the code is open source under an MIT license, and the goal is to really build an ongoing community around that. And towards the end, I'll talk about how you can get involved in that. The name Scaife is in honor of Ross Scaife, a real pioneer in digital classics, who passed away all too early in 2008. And March 15th this year was the 10th anniversary of that passing, and in commemoration of him and his contributions, we not only named the viewer after him, but launched it on the 10-year anniversary on March 15th, 2008. Okay, so let me start off not talking about it, but actually showing you some stuff. And then we'll come back and talk more about underlying technologies and so on. So let me switch over to the viewer at scaife.perseus.org. And we'll start off. There's really two ways you can get into a text, either browsing the library or doing a text search. We'll come back to the text search later, but let's start off with browsing the library. So this...
Sorry, can you enlarge the window with the Scaife Viewer? So, because...
Yep.
Okay, excellent, perfect, thank you.
Is that better?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. So here's a complete list of all the text groups in the library. You can expand any of the text groups to see the particular works under there. Now, this is a considerable list. Even when collapsed, I can expand it all, and you can see just the huge variety of works that exist. I'm only 10% of the way through them, but you get an idea of the quantity. So to make it easier to navigate through, one thing you can do is easily just start typing either the name of a text group or the name of a work, and it will immediately filter down. So if you know you're going to Plato, you can just start typing Plato. It will filter them down. If you're looking for the Apology, you can do that, and obviously find not only Plato's Apology, but Xenophon's and Justininatus and so on. These URNs that you see here we'll come back to in more detail, but they're really important part of the whole way that the Scaife Viewer works. These are unique identifiers for identifying text groups and individual works, and as we'll see later, individual passages within those works, and even individual words or string substrings in those passages. But we'll come back to that in a little bit. Another thing you can do is just list by works rather than sorting by text group. And so here you just get a flat list of all the thousands of works that exist in the reading environment. So if we come back to here and let's say filter by Thucydides, one other thing I wanted to point out is when you can dive into Thucydides as a whole or the history of the Peloponnesian War, but when you hover over here, you can see here these various buttons for different editions and versions of this work. So in the case of the history of the Peloponnesian War by Thucydides, we have a Greek edition, 3 English translations, a French translation, and 2 German translations. And you can jump straight to any of those just by clicking on here. Or you can also, if you want to get a view of Thucydides as a whole or a work as a whole, you can click on one of those. But let's actually show the reader. So I'll click here and go straight to the reading environment. So I just start off collapsing those sidebars because one of the things that I want to emphasize is that we wanted to make the reading experience as clean and as pleasant as possible. Right? First and foremost, this is a reading environment. We want to let you read the text in an enjoyable way. And so we tried to focus on making this what you would expect to find in a reader like a Kindle or iBook or something like that. And so you can collapse the sidebars and just focus on the reading. There is a control here to control the size, so you can adjust the size to whatever works best for you. You can paginate either by clicking on this side arrow, or you can actually also just use the arrow keys to do that as well. So you can very easily page through the text. Yes.
Sorry for interrupting you again. Can you zoom in a bit, because the problem is on YouTube and we have people on YouTube and the screen is a bit small. So if you can.
Sure. Let me.
I see it perfectly well, but maybe just yes. I think for me.
How's that?
Yes, it's better. Thank you.
Okay. Hopefully that's not too. Hopefully we'll still be able to fit everything on the screen.
I know the problem.
As long as that's.
I know. Unfortunately, it's YouTube the problem.
No, I know. The resolution of videos is much smaller than modern monitors. But as long as that's readable now, I think we should be good.
It is.
Good. Okay, so you get the point that that we've really tried to focus on reading first and foremost, and everything then gets added to that. Okay, that's the quick initial tour that I want to do. I want to talk a little bit more about the underlying technology now before we switch back for another demo. So let me resume my slides now. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about the pipeline for getting texts into the reader. This pipeline is particular to the first 1,000 Years of Greek project, which is part of the Open Greek and Latin project. Although this pipeline applies to other things too. It's not. It's also being applied to a certain extent. Parts of it are being applied for existing works in the Perseus Digital Library, and parts of this pipeline are relevant if you're wanting to make your own texts in a suitable format for display in the Scaife Viewer. But in the context of the first 1K of Greek project, the starting point in a lot of cases is OCRing of existing printed editions, and this is really being led by the amazing lace work of Bruce Robertson. Once that OCR work has been done and corrected, there's an important step of appropriately marking up the resultant text, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in subsequent slides. But the texts need to be marked up in TEI XML in a particular way, and then they're put in GitHub. GitHub is used as the store of these marked up texts, and we'll talk a little bit about sort of what the structure of repositories on GitHub needs to be. And then, as we'll see when we talk about the architecture, the Scaife Viewer is actually retrieving the documents right from GitHub. So as long as there's a repository on GitHub that conforms to certain requirements around the directory structure and markup that we'll get to, then it's possible to view in the Scaife Viewer. So it doesn't have to be done as an official part of the Open Greek and Latin project. And in fact, there are a number of repositories that other people had produced independently, that because they met the requirements, it was very easy for us to just point to and have them appear. And again, that comes back to that important motivation at the start of making it really easy to add new texts. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit more about CTS URNs. You saw them briefly when we were looking at the library, but they're really an integral part of the way that the Scaife Viewer works. They are unique identifiers for text groups, for works, for particular editions or translations of those works, and even individual passages and words in those works. So I want to break it down a little bit. Many of you may be familiar with this already, but for those of you who aren't, URNs are strings that begin with URN:. Anything that's CTS compliant starts with CTS. CTS stands for Canonical Text Service. It was developed by Neil Smith and Chris Blackwell. Initially as you know, part of the vision for the Homer multi-text project, but has been adopted very broadly within digital classics. Following the CTS : is this sort of large scope namespace, which really controls what the rest of the URN means. And in the case of most Greek literature, the string that follows is Greek lit, and that's the namespace that then controls really how we structure our work identifiers in the context of Greek. And there's an equivalent for Latin and Persian and so on. And anyone wanting to produce a corpus in a new language, one of the things that will need to be established for doing that is how to structure these CTS URNs, what the CTS namespace would be, what the work identifiers would be. But in the context of Greek literature, that's largely managed as part of the Perseus catalog, and these work identifiers get minted for new works to be included. So after the Greek lit : there's this work identifier that we'll break down in a moment, but then another colon, and then you get a passage reference. So this is actually, what you're looking at now is actually referring to book 1, lines 1 through 7 of the Iliad. This passage reference is optional if you just want to refer to a particular edition, and in fact, even parts of the work identifier are optional if you want to reference higher level objects. And so if you just wanted to reference Homer, then you could stop it at this point here. The TLG 0012 is a text group. Text groups are just a way of organizing works, but in most cases, they correspond to traditional authorship. And so TLG 0012 refers to Homer. Within that, TLG 001 refers to the Iliad. The Perseus-GRC2 refers to a particular edition in the case of the Greek, or if it was in another language, a particular translation. So hopefully that's clear in terms of the structure of CTS URNs, and as I said, they are a very important part of the whole way that the Scaife Viewer works. Okay, let's talk a little bit more about markup and the particular way that the texts need to be structured. I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail about this other than to say that the way the Scaife Viewer works is it assumes that the texts follow the text encoding initiative, and in particular, the EpiDoc subset of that. So the Text Encoding Initiative is a very broad initiative for the electronic markup of texts, and EpiDoc is a subset of that specifically focuses on the kind of texts that we're interested in. And there are some links there you can see to more information about that. And what those two specifications are really doing is saying, first of all, what markup to use, how we mark up lines of poetry, how we mark up different sections of the text, and so on. Also, how we do transcription in the case of transcribing different writing systems and so on. And finally, it has something to say about the metadata that's required on those documents. But I won't go into to really much more detail about that, but it is a key part of readying texts so that they can be consumed by the Scaife Viewer. Another important part of this whole pipeline and getting things into the Scaife Viewer is following the guidelines of the Capitans project. So the Capitans project, Capitans is a software suite that was developed specifically for dealing with citable text, and you can get more information about it at capitans.org. But Capitans adds, as well as being software that's used as part of the Scaife Viewer, it adds certain requirements to the directory structure that should be used for your files, some additional metadata files that have to exist in those directories, and importantly, something called a references declaration that we'll get to in a moment that really helps to link the CTS passage references to the actual XML. So the directory structure is very simple. The expectation, if you want to use Capitans, and because Scaife uses Capitans as applies to the Scaife Viewer as well, the expectation is that your Git repository has a data directory. Under that, you have folders for one or more text groups that the repository is covering. Within that, directories for one or more works that are covered under that text group. And then within that, individual XML files for each work identifier, so an addition or a translation. And in addition to those files, there's this __CTS__.xml. This is the additional metadata file that tells Capitans things like the name of your text group or the name of your work in various languages. So it's possible to say, you know, this work is called this in English, and this in French, and this in German, and so on. And that metadata, simple labeling metadata is captured in this CTS.xml file. So that's really all there is to the directory structure. The only other thing that's important is the references declaration. Now, references declarations are part of the TEI specification, but they're very important. They're used very importantly by Capitans for linking the passage reference in a CTS URN to a particular part of the text. And we'll see again when we come back to actually looking at the Scaife Viewer why that's important. But imagine that we're wanting to retrieve 1.7 of the Iliad. So, you know, we've got a CTS URN, and it consists of unique identifier for Homer and the Iliad and a particular edition of the Iliad. And then it says, I want to look at 1.7, or I want to refer to 1.7, which we want to interpret as book 1, line 7. Well, how do we interpret that as book 1, line 7, and how do we find that in the XML? Well, so here's a very, very short extract of the XML representing the Iliad. And you can see the basic TEI structure, a TEI element, text, a body, and some nested divs, and then finally an L element, which indicates a particular line. But you'll notice that there's this div. It's not the top level div. It's 2 down within the body, that has an N attribute that equals 1. And that's the way that the people that marked up this particular edition of the Iliad chose to represent books. They created a div with a type of text part, a subtype of book, and n equals 1 to say, okay, this is book 1. And then within that, there's an L tag indicating a line of poetry. That's a TEI convention. But then an n equals 7 indicating that this is line 7. Now, in the XML world, there is an addressing scheme called XPath that lets you address particular parts of an XML document. And the XPath for this particular line of Homer in this TEI document might look something like what we have at the bottom. So it's like a directory path navigating down the XML, you know, TEI, text, body, div. But notice it says that within the div, we've got another div. We have this constraint that says, oh, we want the div that has an n attribute equaling 1. And then somewhere within that, that's what the double slashes mean, we want to find an L element that has an n equals 7. And so this is an XPath, which is part of the XML family of specifications for addressing this particular line. And so the goal that we have here is, how do we go from saying, I want to get 1.7 from this document to here's an XPath that lets me get that XML. And reference declarations in TEI enable us to do that. So the way that it works is that we declare these CREF patterns, and they basically consist of a regular expression that matches our passage reference, and then an XPath template for how to turn that into an XPath. So what this is basically saying is, if the passage reference matches the pattern, the regular expression of, you know, one or more characters plus a dot plus one or more characters, then follow this this pattern, and that enables us to therefore generate this XPath from this passage reference. And so what the Capitan's software does, and in particular a server called Nautilus that we'll get to in the next slide when we talk about architecture. What Nautilus is able to do then is take a request for 1.7, convert it to a XPath, and extract just that part of the XML document to send to the reading environment. So these references declarations are an important part of readying a text for use by the Capitan suite, and therefore the Scaife Viewer as well. And that's sort of the final piece that's needed for your text to be displayable in Scaife. Okay, let's talk now about the overall architecture. We'll start at the bottom with this GitHub repository. As I've mentioned before, the way that all the texts start off is being in a GitHub repository, following the Capitan's guidelines that we just discussed. And the reason that they need to follow those Capitan's guidelines is that we use this server called Nautilus, which is able to serve up those texts according to a particular protocol that was developed as part of the canonical text service that I'll talk about in a moment. But Nautilus is able to then receive requests from the backend web application for particular texts or particular passages within those texts. And when we come back to the second demo, I'll actually show a little bit more about how that works. But before we get into sort of the rest of it, I also want to point out that as well as Nautilus consuming the data in the GitHub repository, another thing that happens is we take that data in the repository and run it through an indexing pipeline to put into Elasticsearch, which is the way that we do the text search capability in Scaife. And so not only does Nautilus consume the data, but our indexing pipeline does to put it in Elasticsearch. That indexing pipeline may also make use of external data in order to improve the indexing. So for example, one of the things that we do for Greek at the moment is we lemmatize it so that you can do lemma-based searching. Now, typically the GitHub repository files do not have any lemmatization. If they did, we could make use of that, but typically they're just the raw texts. And so what we do is we lemmatize it as part of the indexing process using external data, and then that's what gets fed into Elasticsearch. So you're able to search by lemmas as well as by the actual surface text. And so that's what happens to the data in the GitHub repository. And then ultimately, that all gets consumed by the back-end web application, which is written in Django, a popular web framework in the Python programming language. So the back-end web application is written in Python using the Django web framework and and also pieces of a project that I started many years ago called Pinax. Now, the only other thing worth mentioning about the back-end web application is that it does make use of XSLT in transforming the XML that comes from Nautilus into HTML and into components that get sent to the front-end web application. And so XSLT is used to do that transformation. So the sequence is basically, the GitHub repository has an entire text. Nautilus is able to carve that up and give you just the particular part of that text that is requested. That's served up in XML. XSLT then transforms that into a way that can be sent to the front-end web application. Now, the front-end web application, as well as making use of HTML and CSS, has a considerable amount of JavaScript written in a framework called Vue.js. And we'll talk a little bit about Vue.js later on when we're looking at some code. But Vue.js is a very nice component framework for front-end web applications. The other thing I'll mention on the server side is Postgres. There are some things that Django stores that aren't text related, user preference information and so on. There's not a huge amount of that yet, but hopefully there'll be more over time. And Postgres is just a relational database that is used to store that. One of the things that's not shown here, because it would just complicate things, is considerable amount of caching at various points. So there's various caching levels that are introduced to improve performance, so that when you, for example, retrieve a text that someone else has already recently retrieved, then it doesn't have to go through the whole process again. It's already ready and available. The last thing I'll mention is that the architecture tries to make use of, or is intended to make use of, external services for bringing in additional information about texts. And that information could be brought in by the back-end web application, or it could be brought in by the front-end web application running in the browser. And those kind of external services include things like getting short definitions of words that you click on, getting morphological information, getting citation information. And we'll see all of those when we go back to the broader demo. But one of the key ways that Scaife can be extended is to make use of more external services. One of the things that we want to do, and I'll talk about this a little bit in the roadmap discussion, is we want to take use of existing stuff out there that exposes information in via an API, and write new widgets for the front-end web application that can consume that, or the back-end web application too. One example of something that's consumed by the back-end web application is when you request the morphology for a particular word in Greek or Latin, that actually goes through the back end, and the back end makes a call out to Morpheus. We decided to do that so that we could do some caching on the server and optimization on the server, but we could have equally requested it directly in the front end web application. But it enables us to do certain processing on the back end. Either way works. Either the front end or the back end can make these calls out. And so we're envisaging that whether it's looking up particular named entities, locations from a map service and so on would be a great example where we're using an external service to bring in information relevant to the text being viewed. And in the case of information about a particular passage or work, the CTS URNs are really crucial for that. If somebody's looking at the first few lines of the Iliad and we're wanting to pull in information from external services about those first few lines of the Iliad, it's crucial that we have a way of identifying what it is that we want to get information about. And the CTS URNs are crucial to that, and you'll see that when we come to the demo. I want to briefly say something more about what's going on between Nautilus and the backend web application. I mentioned before that one of the things that Nautilus is doing is carving up the XML for an entire work and serving up just the passage that's being requested. And I won't go into a huge amount of detail, but the CTS protocol developed by Neil Smith and Chris Blackwell provides an API for accessing that kind of thing. You can request a particular passage and get information, get that text back in XML, as well as information like, well, what's the URN of the previous passage or the next passage, so you can paginate through the passages. And you saw that already in the demo when we were paging through the passages. We were able to do that because we knew what URN to request when somebody wanted to go to the next page. That information was all provided by Nautilus using the CTS protocol. Okay, let's now dive into a more detailed tour that hopefully you'll appreciate more given the sort of architectural and technology discussion that we've already had. So you would have briefly seen beforehand, before I collapsed them, that there are sidebars that you can individually collapse, one on the left, one on the right. And these are the home of various widgets that can be developed largely independently of one another for interacting with the text in various ways. And, as you saw before, you can easily collapse them as you want them or don't want them there. The general convention that we've followed is that widgets that have to do with changing what it is that you're looking at, what passage you're looking at, go on the left. And widgets that have to do with either showing information about the particular passage you're looking at or manipulating it in some way, what it looks like, go on the right-hand side. That's just a convention that we follow. There's nothing inherent in the widgets that say what side they go on, but that's just a convention that we follow. So I just want to briefly say, so each of these is a widget. You can collapse the widgets, so you don't have to see them all. But the other thing you can do in the case of widgets that are particularly long, by default, widgets have a fixed height. So there are actually more words in this word list, but you can scroll through those, or you can actually say, I want to make this the full height, and do that. So if any widget, this sort of comes for free with any widget, and I'll show you the little bit of code that does that later on. But widgets are all collapsible and have this ability to alternate between fixed height and full height. So one of the things that I want to show you on the left-hand side is various ways of sort of navigating around the text. So at the moment, we're looking at 1.1.1 through 1.1.3 of Thucydides' history. And you can see there's a widget that shows you the ancestor structure. If we wanted to look at 1.1 as a whole, which happens to be the same, we can click on that. If we wanted to get all of book 1, I could click on the 1 here. But I can also navigate down to individual children. So now I'm just looking at 1.1. I could page through to get 1.2 and 1.3 and so on. but I can then, using ancestors, navigate back up. So that's one way to navigate through the tree structure. The other thing that we can do is actually type in a passage reference directly here. So if I want to go straight to 1.1.3, I can just type in 1.1.3 and get shown 1.1.3 here. The other way that you can navigate around this is when you hover over a text, you can see in the left margin here the structure, the numbered structure from the XML being shown. So we can see here that we're at 1.1.3. If I want to go back out to just 1.1, I can click on that. One of the things this does is easily shows you, where 1.1.1 ends and 1.1.2 starts, and you can click on that to drill down and so on. So it's very easy to navigate around the text in various different ways, either using these text part links in the margin, using the ancestor widget, the children widget, or directly typing in a passage reference. One thing I'll also show you, which you'll appreciate a little more now, I hope, is the CTS URN is shown over here. So this is, it'll be a little small for people, but this is showing, in this case, that we're talking about, Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War, this particular edition of it, and we're looking at 1.1. And if I, navigate down into 1.1.2, you can see this changes. Now, as well as actually just giving you the CTS URN, you can actually click on this and get back the raw XML that is coming from Nautilus. So this is actually what Nautilus is giving Scaife. This is the CTS protocol, and you can see that we've requested. You can see in this request URN, we've requested a particular passage, and this is what Nautilus has returned. It's returned a TEI document that's just the carved out passage that we requested, and that's what's run through XSLT to produce this. Okay, another thing that we can do in the reading environment is show multiple editions and versions side by side. So I'll just collapse these for now. In this case, in Thucydides, we have a lot of different versions. So we actually have a choice if we wanted to look at English translations of looking at more than one. But if we look at the Hobbes translation next to the Greek, we can see, side by side, the Greek and the English. If we had multiple Greek editions, we could show those side by side and so on. And these stay in sync. So as you navigate around to different pages, different sections and so on, they get synchronized. And similarly, if I'm using this and wanting to navigate to a particular passage reference, that will all be kept in sync. Okay, the other thing I wanted to show is some of the information you can get by, or some of the things you can do by selecting words. Now, one of the somewhat frustrating things about the way that browsers work is handling selection and so on. If you want to just do a normal copy paste and sort of drag and select a passage, you can switch the text mode to normal and just sort of do what you would normally do to select, to copy and paste. But for the purposes of selecting words to do a morphological analysis or reference in some way, you need to switch to highlight mode, and then you can actually pick a particular word, and various widgets that understand how to respond to a selected word or words will do so. So we selected ageneto, and the morphological analysis will actually show you the lemma and the parse of that form. This currently says Morpheus because that's the external service that we're using, but we're going to change that to just say Morphology because the fact that it's using Morpheus is sort of an implementation detail. You'll see the other thing that it's showing is a gloss of that lemma. So this is interesting because what's happening here is multiple external services are actually interacting with one another. What's happening when you're selecting Ageneto is the reader as a whole is saying, oh, the Ageneto has been selected, and individual widgets can decide what to do about the fact that a word has been selected. So the Morpheus widget is saying, well, okay, I'm going to make a call out to Morpheus via the backend web application. And it's going to lemmatize it and get a morphological parse and send that back. Once we've got the lemma back, we then actually send that to a glossing service that uses the short definitions from Helmedick's Logaon project to display here. So the filtering of the word list is actually dependent on what Morpheus is returning. What Morpheus is showing is dependent on what's being selected. And so, the glossing service, the morphological service, they don't know anything about each other, but they're able to consume each other's data they're being integrated together by the Scaife Viewer. Another thing that's happening when you select a word is this particular sub passage reference is being generated. This is another part of the CTS URN spec that lets you address particular strings within a document. And if you were particularly daring, you could actually go in and hand write these things. So if I type in day, it automatically selected that. But normal way of doing that would be to just click on it. You can also shift click to get ranges very easily. So if you want a particular phrase or something, you'll see that while Morpheus and the word list will only don't currently handle ranges, the highlight does. One thing I will point out about this highlighting is that it is persistent. So you might not be able to tell, but up in the URL in the top of the browser, this highlight is actually being incorporated. Exactly the state of the fact that we're looking at a Greek and English edition side by side with this particular phrase highlighted, clause highlighted, is captured in the URL, which means if you bookmarked this or sent someone a link and they clicked on it, they would actually get these same words highlighted and these same text side by side. So I think that's quite powerful for sharing things. But ultimately, we want also this to be the way that the people can potentially annotate texts and so on. So I've talked about most of these widgets here. You may have noticed that the CTS URN widget, when you've got two things side by side, actually show both URNs because obviously they've got slightly different URNs. The edition version part of it here is different. For the last widget that I want to show, which really highlights a lot of the power of CTS URNs, is the CHS commentary, and for that I'll actually switch to Homer. So let me actually jump straight to the Iliad, and I'm just going to go to line 1 of the Iliad. And now I'll actually expand this. Let me collapse the others so we can focus more on the CHS commentary. So the CHS commentary is being developed at the Center for Hellenic Studies and at Harvard. And this is a project that Luke Hollis and his company Archimedes have been working on the development of. And this is a great example of the kind of interoperability that we want to encourage. They have worked on this wonderful commentary site and doing commentaries on Homer and Pindar on an ongoing basis. But crucially, they are tying the comments to CTS URNs at the passage level. And Luke and the team at Archimedes exposed that information via an API. So it was extremely easy, and I'll actually show you the code soon, extremely easy to consume that API in the context of the Scaife Viewer. And so when somebody is looking at a particular passage in the Scaife Viewer, call out to the CHS commentary and say, what do you have to say about this passage? And bring that back in. And on the Scaife side of things, that honestly took all of 30 minutes to implement. I mean, this is still early days on this, but I think it really speaks to the power of CTS URNs and the kind of extensibility and interoperability that they enable. So we can go to the second line and get these commentaries from Gregory Nage specifically on this line and so on. And we're hoping for a lot more of this kind of thing where external resources provide information that are keyed to CTS URNs, either at the work level or the passage level, or even the individual word level. You've seen in the context of the highlighting that if somebody really wanted to focus on a particular word, they could do that and provide information about that particular usage of that word in that context. Okay, the last thing I want to talk about in this demo is the text search capability. So when we talked about architecture, I mentioned that as well as the GitHub repositories being consumed by the Nautilus server, we have an indexing pipeline that goes and indexes those texts as well. So that's done in all languages. And in addition, for Greek, they're lemmatized, so you can do lemma searches for Greek and just normal free text searches for everything else. This uses Elasticsearch, as I mentioned, under the covers, so you get certain capabilities around sort of fuzzy searches as well, and negation and so on, so you can say search for this word but not this word, and so on. So, for example, we can, oops, I'm still in Greek. So I can search for something like love and get all the instances. Obviously, this will be in English translations where the word love appears. And so you can see, obviously, the hits in the New Testament. Hafez, a Persian poet, has the most number of mentions of any text group. Plato obviously mentions it, no surprises for guessing what particular work is going to mention that the most. It's indeed the Symposium. And so you can see in this case of the English searches, you can also do prefix queries, so that if you want things that start with a particular characters, you can search for those as well. So this will get obviously not just write, but writer and writing and so on, as you can see here. Now, in the case of Greek, you can search with and without accents. So if you just want to search for arate, you can do that. Now, of course, I didn't select lemma, so this is searching for the literal form arate, but we can do a lemma search as well. And because we've lemmatized the underlying texts, it's possible to find hits that are in different forms as well of that word. So let me just go back to love. Of course, there's no Greek lemma, love. And I just want to go back to the Symposium. So if you actually click on this, obviously you get the passage in the reader with the hits highlighted. But the other thing that happens is you've got this text search widget on the left-hand side, which lets you navigate around all the other hits. So you can easily go to different all the places where love is mentioned in this particular English translation of the Symposium. And of course, we can bring in a parallel Greek edition here, so we can combine the searched for English text with the Greek text. Now, we don't have word level alignment yet. that's something that we want to support both architecturally and in fact. And that's sort of the next step to this kind of things is being able to say, okay, well, I've found where love is used in the English translation of the symposium. I want to now see, you know, whether it always corresponds to eros and so on in the Greek text. So that's text search in a nutshell. Okay, back to the slides, and we'll finish things up a bit. So I'll say a little bit more about these widgets that we saw. They're Vue.js components inheriting from a common widget component, which gives a bunch of stuff for free. Widgets can have their own internal state, like whether they're open or closed, or what highlight's been selected and so on. They can share state with the reader as a whole, and we saw that with you know, the Morpheus widget doing the lemmatization and then sharing that with the word list widget. And as you've seen in a number of cases, they can make calls to external services. So let me just quickly show you. I'll be very brief with this because I do want to get to the last two slides about how to contribute and sort of what the roadmap is. But I wanted to briefly show some code. Let me make this a bit bigger as well. So this is all open source under an MIT license. You can go to Scaife Viewer on GitHub and the Scaife Viewer repo in particular. And this is a Django project, but you can get up and running, but it makes use of Vue as well. So under static source JavaScript, you get the various JavaScript parts of it. And under reader, we have the widgets. I want to show a couple of things. So this is what Vue looks like. Let me make it even bigger. So this is the component that all widgets inherit. I won't go into a huge amount of detail, but you can see that it's got this basic template. It handles things like you know, clicking on the chevron to open and close it. So that's an example of internal state that exists. There's internal state about whether it's open, whether it's fixed height, and there are various methods for toggling those that are then made use of in the template. So it's a very straightforward component system for HTML and JavaScript. To show an example of another, let me just show the CHS commentary widget. So this is that call out to the Center for Hellenic Studies commentary that I mentioned. So there's very simple HTML template here that basically says, you know, if show is set, then we're going to show something. If there's no comments or the comment length is 0, then we're just going to say no comments found. Otherwise, we're going to loop over the comments and display them. And the way that the comments come about is just through this JavaScript call to an external API. So you can see this was, you know, 71 lines of code that enabled us to take the fantastic work that Luke Hollis and Archimedes and the Center for Hellenic Studies have been doing and just bring it in, all on the basis of the CTS URN. So you can see that crucially, what we do is we grab the URN of the passage being looked at, we send a query to the commentary service with that URN, and that's really the heart of all of this. Okay, so please star this project. If you are a developer of any kind, please get involved. So let me just finalize with some more information about how to contribute. I've already given you the URL, but there it is again to the GitHub repository. If you are interested in contributing, I'd suggest you first of all look at the issues in GitHub. Some of them are marked as good first issues. So I encourage you to look at those if you're wanting to sort of get your feet wet. If you're a Python developer or JavaScript developer, there are other opportunities to contribute as well. I would also encourage people to join our Slack workspace, and if you go to the Scaife Viewer GitHub repository, there's a link to ways to contribute that has a link to the Slack workspace, and the Sunoi wiki for this seminar also has links to that ways to contribute, that has a link to the Slack workspace. So other ways that you can contribute is just producing new and improved texts. This is a great way to contribute. As I said, the goal of this has been to make it much easier to add texts. And if you have GitHub repositories that have texts that are marked up in EpiDoc in a Capitans compliant way, then we can very easily point Scaife to that repository and include them. One thing we would really love help with is the local internationalization and localization side of things. We've set things up for a certain amount of internationalization. We need to do a little bit more, but we really need people to help translate. So this is not translating text, but translating the user interface into other languages such as Italian and German and French, and any language really. This is an important part of opening up philology to a wider range of people, and not assume that English or any other language is the particular medium for doing that. Although that said, it would be really fun, I think, to have a Latin user interface if somebody wanted to localize the interface to Neo-Latin or something. That would be interesting. Developing new widgets and or external services, as I've mentioned a couple of times, is a great way to contribute. If you've got a project that you're working on that can contribute additional information about texts or words or people and places and so on, developing new widgets or new external services is a great way to do that. And then if you're sort of a little more hardcore developer, we would certainly love help with the core architecture. There's still things that we want to do there to better support inline annotation of texts and so on. Some core changes that need to happen. So let me just finish up. We might have a little bit of time for questions then. Is the roadmap, the kinds of things that we're wanting to work on, whether they're done by contributors or us or whatever. I've already mentioned localization. One thing I didn't talk about at all is you may have noticed in the top right-hand corner of Scaife, you can sign up and log in. You can have user accounts. That's not made use of at the moment. We're almost at a point where we've got the first feature that will use that, which will be reading lists. So being able to put together the works that you're wanting to read and track your progress through them and bookmark passages and works and so on. And that obviously requires knowing who you are to persist that information, and so that's where user accounts will be particularly important. But there's lots of things that are going to that we want to do that will increasingly be tied to your particular user account. We want to support some basic note-taking capability, and then also make use of a lot of the work that's already been done on the data and bring that into Scaife around text alignment, tree banks, more stuff to do with external citations. Again, really benefiting from the CTS URN scheme, external citations, being able to say, well, show me articles that have talked about this particular, Pindar ode that I'm reading and so on. And then finally, integration with images, whether it's images of manuscripts or scanned books or whatever. One of the big things that we want to do is better tie together the texts with images of those texts as well. And so with that, I'm finished the official part of the program, and I guess we have maybe a couple of minutes for questions now, Monica.
Yes. Thank you very much, James. It was great. And yes, we have questions. We have people in the Hangout. We also have other people on YouTube. So if you have questions, please. Let me see also on YouTube. Well, I would like to start with 2 comments. So first, I'm very happy that at the beginning you mentioned, well, a bit the Perseus in the 80s and in the 90s, because just 2 days ago in my class on digital philology in Leipzig, I was talking about that with very young students. Perseus was born in a hypertext and hypermedia world before the World Wide Web. So for students who were born in a World Wide Web era, this is something to remember, I think. And I still remember that Perseus were not so old, but anyway, I was born before World Wide Web era, and this is important, I think. So thank you for mentioning that. And now, in 2018, we have the Scaife Digital Library Viewer, so to see really the history, the development of Perseus. And I think this is important for students to get a sense. Then another thing is about the CHS widget. I think that this is a form of, well, micro-publications. We use this expression. Last week we talked about that with Patrick Burns. So if people can comment on single lines or words, these are forms of, I think, micro-publications attached to specific CTS URNs and commenting, publishing something about a text, about a specific word or a specific line. And here, because we have been using in the last years this expression, micro-publications, and now we have a concrete example. Concrete examples for classical philology, thanks to the Scaife Viewer.
Yeah, I mean, one of the important things there is that this micropublication doesn't require you to host those comments on Scaife, right? That it's not about siloing, locking people into a particular platform. You can just micro-publish tied to a CTS URN, and it can be consumed by not just Scaife but potentially other things as well. I will mention one other in response to your first comment. I did want to emphasize one of the things that often gets lost when these new shiny web applications come out is just how much work had to happen to get the texts and the data right. We're talking about decades of work in producing those texts and correcting those texts, marking up those texts, and so on. And that's easy to forget. So just a shout out to all the people that have worked on digital editions for the last 30 plus years.
Well, yes, no, that's true. And another thing about the widget. So so do you plan? So as far as I understand, so the Scaife Viewer is a reading environment, and it's true that people can set up an account, and we can, I think, save notes and other things. Do you plan to implement the part for commentaries? Not within the Scaife, probably, if I understand, because CHS commentaries are external in some way.
Well, we could. I mean, there's certainly. I think I can certainly see us eventually using the environment for taking input, whether annotations of various kinds, certainly. But one thing I want to make sure of is that you don't have to do the annotation there. I think a key part of the interoperability is if somebody else wants to build a tool for doing annotation, we want to interoperate with that. We can build stuff in Scaife, certainly, but I think even more important than the feature set of Scaife itself is ensuring that interoperability between existing stuff, because we want to reduce as much duplication in the digital humanities world as possible.
I totally agree. So to avoid to produce another environment for applications, right. Yes, no.
That said, it obviously we want to make sure that if you're reading, here's a really good example. If you're using the Scaife Viewer, and I should have mentioned this before, if you're using the Scaife Viewer and you find a mistake, one of the visions that we have is that you see a word and you're like, is that right? We want to be able to bring up a scan of the book that was the source of that and say, oh no, there was a mistake in the OCR that wasn't caught or whatever, and be able to write there and then submit a something, a correction, and that obviously there would need to be an editorial pipeline for reviewing that or whatever. But it would, under the covers. So we want to enable that kind of thing to seamlessly happen within Scaife from the user perspective. But under the covers, what that might do is go and create a GitHub issue on the repository. So we're not trying to be, the central place for everything, but we're providing this nice experience for users while they're reading to be able to interact with all these other services.
Yes, thank you for explaining this. I think this is really fundamental, and I totally agree with you. So, and I think this is really a real concept of a collaborative environment. Exactly. So not to have everything within the Scaife Viewer, but to connect this with other external resources. So yes. So thank you for this. We have Anise. We have in the chat in Google Hangout a comment by Anise from Brazil. My question was already answered about inclusion of alignments and tree banks. Yes, and yeah. Well, yes, because we have also a lot of data for, in general, in the Perseus digital library for tree banking. We have been producing a lot for alignments. Alignment, both translation alignments and textual alignments, in the sense that we have alignments, classical text with modern languages, but also textual alignment in the same language to see variants. And this is another cool stuff of the Scaife Viewer, to have the possibility really to view different versions of the same text, so going beyond the first generation of digital libraries, where, for obvious reasons and limits, usually we have just one. And I'm saying just one edition because there is a lot of work behind. So behind producing digital data, but now we can start visualizing more editions. And this is part of the Open Greek and Latin project, where we are digitizing different editions of the same work for this purpose. And so we can visualize this also in the Scaife Viewer. I don't know if there are other questions. We still have 3 minutes. Then we have, so you have, as usual, the class outline on GitHub for this session. So you have—
Yes, and I'll share the slides as well.
Yes, thank you very much, James. Yes, these are important because we have people following these videos also after the live version. And so we have your prescription, the outline, excellent. I see the links, including the ways to contribute, which is important for developers or for people with repositories, with text. This is really fundamental, something we are looking for. And then James will add also the slides. So if, and I'm looking on YouTube, so 1 second, yeah. So I'm sorry for the video, but anyway, the demo was perfect. And so now we don't have other questions. So James, really, thank you very much for this presentation. This is your first time in Sunoikis. I hope so.
Hopefully it won't be my last.
No, definitely.
I had a wonderful time.
The risk for you is that we will invite many other times to contribute and to talk about future developments of the Scaife Viewer. And given that the class outline is on GitHub, I'm sure that the people will email you with the questions. So definitely,
good.
You are now part of the community. So really, thank you for this great presentation. And now, so next week, we will be back on Thursday with linguistic annotation with Anise Ferreira. She's in the Hangout. Every week she's with us in the Hangout, and she will present about linguistic annotation with Eleni Bozia from the University of Florida. So we will see next week. As for now, thank you very much, and good afternoon and good night for people in my time zone. And James, for you, I think still good
lunchtime.
Lunchtime. So enjoy your lunch. Okay. Well,
thank you.
Thank you and see you. Bye. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.